The next disease that we're going to talk about is anemia, which is caused by either low ingestion or low absorption of iron. Iron is what allows our red blood cells to carry oxygen to all of the tissues in our body. And so, if we don't have iron, we don't have red blood cells, we don't have oxygen to all of our body tissues, which, as you can imagine, leads to a lot of issues. Iron's role in the body is to help form red blood cells. Red blood cells are kind of just these sacs of hemoglobin. So hemoglobin has some globins and these four molecules called hemes. At the center of each of the hemes is an iron. Iron has a high affinity to bind to O2, which is the kind of oxygen that we breathe. And so through this O2 iron bond, hemoglobin is able to bring red blood cells um, oxygen all over the body to all of the tissues. So its main role is to transport oxygen to the body's tissues. So what happens with anemia? Since there's no iron, there can be no oxygen going into the red blood cells and bonding to this hemoglobin. And so there are fewer red blood cells um, and red blood cells that are not carrying oxygen. There are several causes of iron deficient anemia. One is just not consuming enough iron. This is common in vegetarians, for instance. Um, Massive blood loss. So, say you're in a traumatic event like a car accident, you lose a lot of blood since there is a lot of blood leaving you. It means like there's a lot of iron leaving you because that those red blood cells have um, iron in the hemoglobin. Um, and so when you lose them, you end up losing a lot of your iron in your body, as well as with pregnancy, because fetuses require a lot of red blood cells. You're supplying blood supply to a whole new human, and so um, pregnancy is a massive um, cause of anemia. Symptoms of anemia, as we could expect, on the left is somebody with normal blood, and someone on the right has not enough blood cells. They have normal hemoglobin. This person has low hemoglobin, so fewer red blood cells. Um, The symptoms of anemia include extreme fatigue and weakness because, again, oxygen's not getting to your body, and so it doesn't have the energy to perform cellular respiration. Pale skin, chest pain, so a fast heartbeat, headache, cold hands and feet because you don't have good circulation through all of your bodies, so your extremities are the most impacted. Long-term effects of anemia are heart problems because your heart must pump more blood to compensate for the lack of oxygen. Um, and this can lead to an enlarged heart or heart failure. During pregnancy, this can lead to low weight babies as well as premature births, growth problems in children because, again, they don't have enough oxygen to grow. Um, However, anemia is incredibly common all over the world. Something like 60% of people in the world have some version of anemia, and the long-term effects and these severe effects are rare, but it's important to note them. Uh, Finally, we're going to talk about iodine deficiency, which causes goiter and congenital iodine deficiency syndrome, as well as hypothyroidism. Um, so this is something that happens primarily in really low income countries near the equator. And one of the reasons for that is that most salt is fortified with iodine. And so if you can look on like your salt container, it might say iodized salt. And so even though you don't necessarily know that you're getting salt, iodine intake, most people are through that a measure. And so um, really who we're talking about are people whose salt hasn't been fortified with iodine. So if you have low iodine, this causes a drop in T3 and T4 hormones, which are both thyroid hormones, and this causes hypothyroidism. That means that your thyroid is not um, regulating the way that it should. And this often leads to goiter or enlarged thyroid. Iodine's role in the body is to maintain healthy thyroid function, and the thyroid controls the speed of metabolism. That is how quickly you break down food, what of that food you keep on as fat or carbs in the body, and what you dispel, and how quickly your cellular functions run. So it's really a name for a lot of different things, but metabolism is really important. We talked about sugar metabolism in the context of diabetes. And so this is what a healthy thyroid looks like. It's right here on your neck. It's this butterfly-shaped organ. And what happens when you have enough iodine? So iodine combines with an amino acid, so this building block of a protein called tyrosine, and that makes T3 and T4, which are these hormones. But no iodine means no T3 and T4 to regulate the thyroid. So you end up with symptoms of hypothyroidism. So that includes things like weight gain, because your body is not efficiently using the energy that it is getting. Instead, it's pushing most of it to storage. And also have symptoms like tiredness. And this is a positive feedback regulatory loop. Um, so when you don't have iodine as this stimulus here, then your body kind of throws this into overdrive and tries to make lots of T3 and T4. And that's what ends up happening here with your enlarged thyroid is this overproduction of T3 and T4 due to lack of iodine, due to this being thrown out of whack, ends up swelling this organ. So this is what it would look like in a person. People might have fatigue, again, because they're not getting to use that energy on a cellular level, might have a puffy face or hoarseness because of the thyroid pressing on their throat. Um, and things like thinning hair, and an enlarged thyroid gland or goiter. So how do we treat micronutrient deficient diseases? On a micro level, on a person-to-person level, it's really easy. We just give people the micronutrients that they need, and we make sure that they can absorb them. So we make sure that there's nothing going on with their gastrointestinal system, and that they have access to that micronutrient. So one example of this might be sometimes women who cover might have low levels of vitamin D from the sun. And so either they might take a supplement or they might go out of their way to eat vitamin D enriched foods. Um, on a macro level, we can also see if there's a population level intervention, like I talked about iodized salt, that would prevent further disease, because we know everybody needs um, this type of intervention. So another example is fluoride, which is in drinking water. Um, everybody gets fluoride. We don't have to worry about individuals deciding whether or not to consume food with fluoride, or if they need to take vitamins or supplements, unless there is another issue with them. So we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to think about this man who has ended up slipping and falling on his back, and he broke his back from falling on this ice. So if I asked you, why did he fall on this ice, you might and break his back, you might say because the ice is slippery. And that's true, but that's only a little bit of the puzzle. Let's say that this man also has bad balance because when he was 7, he had a concussion, and his brain has been shaken up ever since. He has bad balance. Let's also say that when he was in his 30s, he developed a degenerative back disease, and so he has discs in his back who are not in the right place. And whenever he fell, he hit one of those discs. So you can see how just falling on your back might not be the direct cause of breaking your back from this instance, that there are several levels. So a component cause is a piece of the sufficient cause needed to begin a disease. So it's any of these causes. So say in our man's case, he had a concussion 7 years when he was 7 years old, and that begins this particular bout of disease, right? His fall is directly related to this particular event. A sufficient cause is the complete mechanism that's needed to start. So say we have the initial concussion, say we have not drinking enough milk, say, and so having weak bones because of that. Say we have the degenerative back disease, say that he's depressed, so he's distracted. And finally, we have this slip on the ice. And so all of these biologically interact with one another in order to cause this entire situation, which is the disease, which is the fall. We can have multiple different causes of disease. So not all back breaks are caused by this particular combination of factors. So not all back fractures have something to do with a degenerative disc disease or with a fall or even with a concussion. So we can have multiple different ways. If these are all different component factors, they can combine in different ways to cause the same disease. Hypothetically, we have a set number. So the details might vary, but trauma might be a single factor. Lack of balance that causes fall might be a single factor that's in multiple different sufficient causes. It's important to note that these are all the same size. We can't tell how big any one of these slices would be, and so we just represent them in our causal pie as the same size. So this E is a component cause. This entire thing is a sufficient cause. There are multiple sufficient causes for every disease. We can also talk about necessary causes, which are a component cause that has to be present in every single sufficient cause. So let's say that now we're talking about the example of influenza. And so there can be many different factors that lead to influenza, but in each of these, every single sufficient cause has to have an A, because, say, in this example, A is exposure to the flu virus. So every single example of flu has to come from some exposure to the flu virus. And so this is the necessary cause that slots in and is a cause of the disease in every sufficient cause. We can also talk about induction period and latency periods. So induction period is the time between a component cause happening and the initiation of disease. So say here we're talking about back to our man on the ice, and most of the things that are in place have already happened. And then G is that he has this degenerative back disease. And so he developed it in his 30s, say he's 40 now. There can be a 10-year induction period for component G. So it's 10 years between getting this degenerative back disease and finally having the missing component in this piece, be that he slips on the ice and falls. So the time between getting the degenerative back disease and breaking his back, partially because of the degenerative back disease, is 10 years. It's important to note that induction periods for each different component cause can be different. So say B in this example is that he had a concussion when he was 7. So it's almost 30 years between these two events that end up causing this entire sufficient cause mechanism in order for him to have a broken back. We can also talk about comorbidities, which is the simultaneous presence of at least 2 diseases at the same time. And we're talking about all of this at this particular time because a lot of micronutrient deficiencies accompany other types of illnesses. So, for instance, anemia is really common with malaria, or let's say hemophiliacs, right? So if you're a hemophiliac, so you don't have good clotting in your blood, you might bleed a lot, then you're more likely to have problems with anemia because you are losing that blood and not maintaining as much iron. So anemia and hemophilia in that way can be considered comorbidities. You also have things like HIV and Kaposi sarcoma, which is a particular kind of cancer, or tuberculosis, which often happens alongside HIV because your immune system is weakened than it would normally be. So we talked about our induction period, but we also have a latency period, which is the time between the initiation of disease and diagnosis or clinical symptoms. So say that you get exposed to the flu virus here. We're moving back to the flu. And so this last component cause creates the beginning of disease, where you have a full component cause, so it's no longer the induction period. You're no longer waiting for the beginning of disease, but then you start the latency period. This is the time between you are exposed to the flu virus and you actually develop symptoms that could be recognized as the flu virus. So you finally have aches and pains and maybe a fever.